Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Consumed by Grace podcast. We are here for season 3. We are your hosts. I am Pastor Henry Prater.
I am Pastor Brooke Hemphill, and I almost forgot to say pastor because I'm still not used to that.
And you know, sometimes it happens. You know, you also run in like, do I say reverend? Do I say pastor? Do I just say, hey, I preach? By the way, we are here at Arab First UMC. This is a podcast that we started over a year ago now. We started filming to begin to talk about who we are and what we believe, and we're just continuing that, hitting on some different things. And this season, we're going to kind of go back from where we were in season 2. So if you remember season 2, we were talking about those verses that look great on pillows and cross stitches, those Bible verses that are inspirational, and delving into the context. Well, if that was zooming in, now we're zooming out to talk a little bit more about the Bible as a whole. The Bible, which is foundational for us as Christians. It's one of the key ways that God has given us to tell the story of his redemptive love for humanity. But a lot of us don't know what to do with it.
Yeah, because it can be intimidating, right? So Pastor Henry has a stack of Bibles here. You probably can't see them on the video, but there's several of them.
So I went through and grabbed several Bibles that represent, this is one of the first Bibles that I got that was mine. You can still see my name in the gold lettering on there. And we've got the Bible I got when I was ordained provisionally. We've got one of the first study Bibles I have. Here's just another study Bible. Brooke is holding one of the Bibles that I will take a lot when I go visit.
But they're big and thick.
They're big and thick. And here's the thing. Each one of them represents a different translation.
Yes. Which we're going to get into.
We're going to get into on a later episode. But so there's a lot that we don't know about the Bible. Even if we've read it our entire lives, there's a lot we don't know, we don't understand, and sometimes that not understanding makes us want to not read it.
Yeah, because it is a mistake, and it's intimidating. I can remember being, I was raised in church, and so obviously the Bible has been in my hands my whole life. But if you're new to the church, if you're new to faith, it can be a little daunting when you open a Bible and you're like, A, where do I start? B, even when I do start, what does it mean? The language that it is in, obviously it's been translated couple of times.
Yes.
And
many times.
Yeah. And so it can be intimidating. It's hard to know what to do with it. So that's what we're going to get into.
Yeah. And part of this also stems out, I'm leading a class for our one of our Wednesday night small groups that is using the book, What is the Bible? Exploring the Bible by the Massachusetts Bible Society that is really focusing on biblical literacy. And not necessarily from a particular perspective, though this is Ann Dickinson is a Christian author. This is a Christian group, but it's more concerned with getting people to actually read the Bible. And so I like that. So it takes a lot of some of the partisanness that can be in with study Bibles, but while also owning their own particular perspective. And I appreciate the way that they do that. But for episode 1 today, we're going to spend some time talking about where did the Bible come from? How did we get the Bible? Because there's a thought that maybe a lot of us have not articulated, but just all of a sudden, one day, God dropped a book in our laps as humans, and that was the Bible.
Yeah.
And, that's one of the things, people would say, well, obviously, No. But then you think, well, then where did the Bible come from?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so let's talk about where did it come from? When did we get the Bible? Mm-hmm. Did we get the Bible in its entirety at one time?
We did not. We did not, particularly the Christian Bible that we now have today. That, one could argue that this book in quotes was really developed over a period of 2,500 years. It was a long time in development because it started with oral tradition.
Sure.
It started with stories being told and retold and retold. Even as writing was first being invented, there were these stories, and even the stories that are covered in just the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. We call it the Old Testament, the Pentateuch, the Torah. Those represent thousands of years of time in some shape, form, or fashion.
Yeah.
So that's worth keeping in perspective. In her book Epic of Eden, Dr. Sandra Richter talks about the earliest we can date anything in the Bible is roughly 2000 that we get from the Old Testament. But the canon of the Old Testament itself would have been developed sometime between maybe as early as like 500 BC or BCE to as fully fleshed out as maybe even 200 CE. And there's some very particular reasons behind that. And just to talk a little bit of history, when writing of the Old Testament first got started, they didn't collect it in something like this, in a book, in what would have been a codex at the time that we now call a book. It would have been a collection of scrolls. And these would have been a collection of scrolls that was most likely kept. It could have been kept in the temple. There were probably some in the palace. There would have been some priests and Levites that may have had access to stuff. But there would have been a central location. But what eventually started happening?
Tell me.
Well, first, the northern kingdom was destroyed by Assyria, and then later the kingdom of Babylon was destroyed, or the kingdom of Babylon destroyed Judah and Jerusalem and the temple, and the people went into exile. Thankfully, there were priests and others who went into exile, who kept it with it. But what really happened, and so one of the thoughts is it may have been Ezra, the author of the book of Ezra, the one who helped lead the people of Judah, and then they would become known as the Jews, back to their homeland during the reign of Cyrus the Great. He is the one who started collecting all of this and putting it in a form as a particular unit, these sacred writings. And so it's funny to think about, because we know this, but in that point in time, that wouldn't have been quite a big of a concern to have a particular collection of it, because everybody knew where they were, and the most important thing was the temple.
Yeah. So I have a question, Henry. Did people memorize this?
Quite a few would have.
If they didn't have access or couldn't get to the temple, and they wanted access, there were people who would have had this memorized so that they were able to share in group settings, just like maybe we do.
Absolutely. That's one of the things about the priests. It's interesting for us to think about the priest, and particularly like how we as clergy are today. Being a clergy for many of us is a full-time job. We do this week in and week out. In that day and time, the priests would essentially be on call, and they would have their time to work the temple, and they would then go home.
Yep.
So, many of them, obviously we have examples of not good ones, but many of them, they did their time, they went home, but then they took those knowledge of those sacred writings, sacred practices home with them,
Yeah.
and would teach them when they went home.
Yeah, in their own communities.
In their own communities, while they were farming, while they were doing something else, as they were spread throughout the people.
Yeah. So we're talking about the Old Testament. Let's get on to the New Testament. About when did we start developing the writings of the New Testament?
So some of the Paul's letters, you could say, were written as early as the early 40s, maybe even the late 30s. There may have been some of those writings. Most of the New Testament would have been written somewhere between, say, 50 to 60 AD or CE, Anno Domini or Common Era, to possibly about 110, 120.
Okay.
Would be when most people think that they were written. And sometimes written can mean wrote down and edited and compiled together. All of these things that were writings, but this is when they finally came into a particular form. So that's when that would have happened. The New Testament itself officially came together roughly around, I think I wrote it down, 382 at one of the councils. I think it was the Council of Rome, and then confirmed at the Council of Carthage. This came into response. So there's a fun bit of Christian history. There was a early bishop in the church. His name was Marcion, and Marcion decided that he wanted to figure out what the canon was going to be. But Marcion was we didn't have this. They didn't have this word necessarily at the time, I don't believe, but we would think of him as anti-Semitic today.
Okay.
He did not want anything to do with the Old Testament, that Jewish God. The Christians should be different, should be moved on from that, and so he axed the Hebrew Bible. He axed the Gospels that he perceived as too Jewish. So his Bible was just a heavily edited Gospel of Luke.
Okay.
And Paul's letters.
Okay.
With, again, edited so that they weren't too Jewish. So he had to edit down Romans a bit. And that became known as the Marcionite Bible. Now, he was later deemed a heretic, and his way to provide. But that gave rise to a movement of, hey, we need to decide what Scripture is.
Yeah.
What are those things that are inspired by God, given to humanity to be able to lead the church?
Yeah. And so you mentioned the word canon a minute ago, and that's what you're leaning into now. So can you elaborate a little bit on the word canon, maybe what that means, and then talk about how did we decide what got included in what we know as the Bible today?
And so that's interesting. So a canon is that thing that you often saw on ships, and there was a giant no, not that canon. Just one N instead of two. CANON. So canon is the collection of writings, and what's interesting, especially for those the Protestants, the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible is 33 books. The New Testament is 27 for a total of
66.
Look at you! You didn't know there was going to be
pop quiz. I was going to say 62. I knew that wasn't correct. That's why I stopped.
And I think, 39 and 27. That's and you'll hear we're getting into numbers now, so there's possibility we're going to say something wrong.
That's right. I don't do math
catch
either.
Us and forgive us.
Just a side note.
But 66 books. But here's an interesting bit of trivia for you. So that's what was decided. Obviously the original Hebrew Bible was written in
you tell me.
Hebrew.
Oh, I thought you were saying a year.
Oh, no.
I was
sorry.
like, I definitely don't know that pop quiz.
No, it was written in Hebrew.
Hebrew, yes.
However, Hebrew as a language started falling out of use in the 3rd and 4th centuries BC. At that point in time, Alexander the Great conquered most of the known world, and Greek became the language of that empire, and even later with the Roman Empire, even though Romans spoke Latin, Greek was still the language of the empire for the most part. So what happened around the 200s is you saw the creation of something called the Septuagint. You might also see LXX, and that is the Greek Old Testament. The Greek Old Testament is the Old Testament that most likely Jesus, Paul, the other writers of the New Testament would have had the easiest access to. Now it's they know Hebrew most likely. They also spoke Aramaic, their local dialect, but that would have been the most common Bible in that time, was the Greek Old Testament. Later, a group of Jewish scholars called the Masoretes started to bring Hebrew back. That's where we get our version, our Protestant version of the Old Testament.
Okay, from the Masoretes.
From the Masoretes and from the Hebrew text. The Septuagint that the writers of the New Testament would have had, that the Roman Catholic and Greek Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, and other churches had, it had more books.
Tell us more.
If you've ever heard of the Apocrypha or the Deuterocanonical books, if you've ever went to a Catholic church, a Greek Orthodox church, a Coptic church, and heard a reading from the book of Sirach, or heard them read a psalm that you didn't know, it's like, wait, I thought the psalm stopped before they got that high.
Yeah.
That's because the Septuagint included some writings, Jewish writings, that would have been later than that original Hebrew Bible. And so those writings, they thought, well, you know what, these are good, we're going to put them in. Others have disagreed, and so that's where you get the Apocrypha. And we'll talk a little bit more about that and some of the fun things about the Apocrypha. We'll also talk about the Pseudepigrapha, because that's a really fun...
Pseudepigrapha. I got that right the other day, by the way.
She did. So that's a fun word to use in conversation. But it's all these writings that ended up not being included in the canon.
I was going to just say, but we can still use those, right?
We can still use that, and that's a very important thing. And as I was preparing for this, I ran across a quote, and I'll have to go find it. But the purpose of the canon, and particularly in the early Christian church history, was to find those gospels, those letters, those other things that were helpful for worship and building up the church.
Okay.
They weren't using them in the way that we use them, scientifically, scholarly, debating over this, that, and the other. What is actually useful for the church to build it up, that we see God in this.
Right.
So there are others of these books. A good example is a book called the Didache. It is a very wonderful book. It's kind of like the first church manual, the first manual for preachers.
Okay.
They didn't view that as inspired and helpful in worship. It's a very practical thing. It's a great document, but it didn't rise to the level of Scripture and make it into the canon.
Well, and like for us, church looks different and worship looks different today than it did then as well. And so I don't know, I guess I'm saying it's important to think about our context too.
Yes.
Like when we're talking about these things, it's important to remember what context they were in and what context we are in, and how these things are still used in worship today too. So, yep.
Just one final thought that kind of goes into that, and we might talk just a little bit more about this, is, as it's often said, the Bible is the most important book in the world. Yes, however, this is not a uniform book. Part of the reason we get ourselves in trouble, you mentioned earlier, which is so true, we start to read it, and we do it like a standard book. and we just start at the first page and begin to read.
Yep.
Sometimes that's a good way to read the Bible. That's not the only way to read the Bible, because the Bible is not one cohesive narrative. The Bible is not even in chronological order.
Yeah.
And we talked about that the other night, and people are like, I guess that makes sense, but I hadn't thought about that.
And it's confusing when you're reading stories and you get to somewhere and you think, well, I haven't already read this or heard of this.
Absolutely. You know, even in Paul's letters, those don't appear in chronological order.
Yep.
So it is a collection of books. That's why in some ways Codex is better. This is a library of God's interaction with humanity over the period of thousands of years that we are blessed to have. So that's something to be aware of. Another thing to be aware of is genre, because the genre of a book matters. What the book's purpose is matters. You know, you don't pick up a math textbook and then wonder why you can't cook after that. You know, you don't pick up a book of poetry and then want to get scientific information out of that.
Absolutely.
It's the same thing with the Bible. It's worth learning the genre of the individual books, what that means, what it was set out to do, and who the audience was for it. You know, for example, let's start with the Gospels. The Gospels are what are known as ancient biographies. Now, when we think a biography, you know, this is supposed to tell the story of a person's life, and it is supposed to be as factual as possible. Ancient biographies had a little bit different focus. Ancient biographies, yes, they were telling the story of a person's life, but they were also supposed to be persuasive. These were things that were used for preaching and convincing people, particularly for the Gospels, of who Jesus was and why we follow him, why we worship him, why we believe that he was truly the Son of God sent to earth to be the Savior of the world. So it's written differently, and so it gets held to a little bit different standard than, say, the biography of an American president.
Sure. Well, and again, you have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all telling the same story, right? But they don't read the same.
They don't read the same.
They don't have the same. They don't all have the same stories.
They don't. You know, it's interesting. So what we know now. You know, actually, I take that. That's going to be better on a later podcast. I'm going to save the Gospels. We'll probably do a whole episode just on the Gospels and talking a little bit about that. But that's a good point to make, to note that even though these books are telling the same story of the person Jesus, they tell it in different ways, and they highlight different things, and they even use some different source material.
Yeah, sure.
Which is very interesting.
Well, and then you think, well, how is that different than the Psalms? Obviously, very different. Very different.
How is that different than First Kings and Second Kings? Why does First and Second Samuel and First Kings, Second Kings? Why is that? A lot of that get retold in First and Second Chronicles.
Yeah.
What is all that? Those would be some of the questions that we're going to explore just a little bit as we talk about the Bible and how we begin to understand it better.
Sure, and that's why, again, genre is important, because you're approaching the scriptures with a certain thought in mind when you look into that. A question I thought about that I want to ask you. If I'm a person who's sitting down and I want to know, well, what is the genre of Matthew or Romans or the Psalms or First or Second Kings? How do I find that out?
So a number one thing I can tell you for that, and that this will get into a little bit, is like, for starters, it's easy to go look for a study Bible. That more often than not, and let me excuse me for just a second while I grab one of mine.
I have that one too.
Yeah, so this is one of my first study Bibles. It's an NIV Life Applications study Bible. So it has some good study materials, but what it also wants to do is make things applicable to you. I recommend that everybody have a study Bible of some sort, because it does the research, and we'll talk more about this in that particular episode. But you see, it gives you a whole listing. This is right before the book of Judges, and you can see it gives pages of information that lets you know, who this was possibly written by, why this was written by, what was the setting, who were some of the key people in this, who would have been the original audience. And then when you look through that, you'll see. It's funny. This one is particularly fun. The pages will be, what's that here? This big. The Bible text is this, and then this is notes.
Yes.
Those notes give you some of that key information to help to begin to understand that. And we'll talk a little bit more, but just I think one thought as we are starting to wind down this this episode. I hope we haven't been too rambly on this one. The importance to thinking about the genre, the importance to thinking about the author, the importance to think about what is this book trying to say. I think is summed up in a phrase that I've heard used many times, and it's become one of my favorites. To read the Bible seriously, we have to take what it says. You can take the Bible literally and not take it seriously. An example of this, you hear, Shakespeare. We all know that quote, "Shall I compare you to a summer's day?" And those of us here in Alabama think, well, you're too hot, you're miserable, and you're probably damp.
Yes.
No, he's using imagery. He's not literally saying you are a summer's day.
Right.
The Bible does that too. The Bible uses poetic language in various different things to communicate and help the people of God better understand how God relates to us.
Yeah.
And so sometimes when we read something, to take it literally is one way, but when we get behind what the genre is, when we get behind what the text is actually trying to say, we have a better chance to understand what God is trying to say to us.
Yeah. So we're going to dig into that for the rest of this season. There's a lot to know and a lot to learn, not just about what's in the Bible, but about the Bible itself. And the reason that we want to do this and the reason that we should do this is so that we are getting the true meaning behind, and obviously open for interpretation in some ways, but we're digging in a little. It's not enough, is what we're saying. It's not enough to just open it and read it. We got to know where it comes from, who's saying it, why does it matter, what was happening in their world at that time, to be able to say that some of these things, and why is that important to us today. And so I think this is going to be a fun season of digging into all of the different things and the nuances that come along with reading our Bible. And what a gift. What a gift it is for all of us. And so I'm excited to get to do that together with you, Henry, and with all of you this season.
Yeah, this is going to be a ton of fun. We're glad to be with y'all for this.
Yep. So come back next week for episode 2. We're going to dig in a little bit deeper and go into maybe what some of these translations mean to us, and maybe how to pick the right one for you.
Yeah. Do we all have to go back to the King James?
Yeah.
what's the deal with this message? Why is it so different than everything else?
Yes.
It's going to be fun.
Yep.
Thank y'all for stopping in with us. We hope you enjoy. Give us a like if you're enjoying what you hear. Subscribe to us so that you can get notified. You can find us anywhere you find podcasts. You can also find us on YouTube. So you might, if you've been used to checking us out one way, check us out somewhere else.
Yeah.
And don't forget to share it with a friend.
Yeah. If you love what you hear, share it with a friend and let us know. Tell us what you like about Consumed by Grace podcasts. We can't wait to see you next week.
Bye.
Bye.